you guys for coming. My name is Lynné Cravens. I'm the gallery manager here at TCU. I co-curated the show with Iris Bechtol. I'll let you introduce yourself.
I'm Iris Bechtol. I'm an artist and I do curating independently, but also I am the cultural programs coordinator at the Cultural Center in Dallas, Texas.
Yeah, so Iris and I have been working on the show for a couple of years now. We did a first version of this in the spring of 2019. And that show actually traveled to Charleston State University. And so Sarah Jane Parsons, our gallery director, asked us to bring Sequential Self to TCU. And so because this is the largest venue I think we've ever showed the work in, we decided to take another pass at the curation to make a new version. Not that our first artists weren't amazing, but after working on that show for about 2 years, we were like, we're ready to we have a better idea of what we want the show to be. And so we decided, let's bring in some new artists to really focus in on this version of the show.
Yeah.
Kind of our thoughts about comics. So
we did keep 3 artists from the first iteration of the exhibition that we really felt needed to kind of keep moving with our ideas of what the show is about.
Yeah. So the show is about comics, so comic book art and comics, but on another level, I mean, that's so many things, right? Like comics have changed so much throughout history, by the last 100 years, but really in the last 20 years, comics have really kind of gone through a renaissance of changing from superheroes and your kind of big name Marvel and DC comics to having more independent creators making content about literally anything you could ever want content about. And so that's really where I feel like this show fits in. Is we're really focused on creators making independent work. A lot of it is based in autobiographical narratives or personal narratives, or at least using that as like a reference point for fiction. But this show specifically is about the artists and the creators' identities, especially around gender and race identity, LGBTQ identities. So that was kind of our focus, was this really like vulnerable narrative that the artists are doing.
And with the second curation, we really wanted to be very intentional about making the show representative of a lot of diverse voices. And we realized in our first curation of the show in 2019 that we weren't as intentional about that, and we were sort of thinking about all of the stories and the content, but less about the people making them and about those voices. So we were really intentional about making sure that we had a lot of diversity in our exhibition in terms of like gender, race, and then also just in terms of like how they're presenting the figure, how they're presenting the narratives.
Yeah, and I think that the first one, I don't want to speak for you guys, but for me, like I read a lot of like mainstream comics, so moving more into like purposely researching independent comics was kind of a new side of comics I wasn't as familiar with. And so, but ever since the first iteration of the show, like it's just been a casual continued research hole of like finding new artists, like following people on Instagram or their websites. And by the time Iris and I got to this curation, it's like, oh, I mean, we're going to dig deeper into the curation because we want to do, as good of a job as we can, and I'm an over planner, so I can't help but just do everything. But I was also like, oh, I already have a really good starting point because I've been purposely looking and finding new artists for the last 2 years. And, I think it is just to say the show, even in the, I don't want to even say we have a strict parameter, but the, ideas, the curatorial ideas we have behind the show could be curated hundreds of times over and over with brand new artists. So artists are just out there making amazing work, and even since we kind of like finalized our artist list for the show, which was probably a few too many because there's 12 artists, which is a lot of artists, but how could you just say no to any of them? They're all so amazing. Our spreadsheet of artists has just like continued to grow even since selecting the artists for the show. So I hope at some point we get to not only show this version of the show again, but maybe curate a version.
Yeah, I mean, and from our list, there were, I think, probably 20 to 24 artists total from the list for this show. And then we culled that down, and then we even had some artists that they couldn't commit. So there were some artists that we wanted in the show, but they couldn't, you know, make a commitment because of like the timeline, or they had other, you know, priority things that they had to work on. So, yeah, I mean, the show could definitely be totally different, and also it could be bigger.
For sure. Oh man, like I would love a huge space, or maybe one day we'll publish an anthology of art. So, yeah.
But as we go through the exhibition, I do want to note that, you know, Lynné mentioned earlier how comics have changed over the last 20 years, going from, you know, sort of like reading the traditional kind of floppy or even a trade. You're getting a lot of content online now, and you're getting even a lot more content on social media. And several of our artists put a lot of their work on social media, and they really neglect their websites. so if you're looking at some of these artists and you go to their website and you're like, oh, this doesn't look like, you know, they updated this for a while. Check out their social media, because that's really like when they're spending a lot of their time nowadays, because it's, you know, more immediate, it's very quick, they can just shoot an image and then make a post.
Which is one reason why Iris designed this lovely zine that we do have available online, but it has the websites and Instagram handles for everyone in the show. So if you don't have an hour to sit and read the entire or walk around and read the entire exhibition, you can go home and sit and check out this work plus so much other work that we just had limited space and couldn't show.
Yeah. And so some of the work we have is, you know, the artist works digitally, and then we output that from digital files, and then some of the work we have originals, but that artist also works digitally. And I guess we can go ahead and start with Erin's work. Do you want to talk about Erin's work?
Sure.
So this is Erin Nations' work, and you'll see we have both some originals. These are all like hand drawn on paper with text handwritten on them, and then we also have the digital file that we printed on the printers here. And the way Erin works is he will make these drawings, and then he'll scan them in, and then Photoshop he digitally colors them, and then also does some playing around with the text. So again, these artists are working like on multiple platforms. They're working with, you know, traditional media, pen and ink. Some of them work with watercolor or other types of media, and then but they're also, you know, they understand the whole digital world and how to publish and those kinds of things. Erin is a trans artist, and a lot of his work is, most of it is autobiographical. Even if you see something like here, where he's doing this thing with the cat, that's his cat. So that's about, you know, an encounter that he had with his cat coming home. But a lot of the work really deals with his experience. Living as a trans person and going through transition. And so you learn, we were talking to Erin yesterday during our chat, which you can see on the 18th. And so he really talked about how, you know, his work is really coming from a personal experience of his own, and how he makes that because it's what he wants to read about.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's really beautiful work, and I love like the fact that he sent us some older work. So the stuff next to Iris is from Gumballs, which is a series he published, which we do have in our little in-gallery library. But that's older work, and so you kind of see this beautiful like stylistic transition of Erin's, where you kind of have like him softening the jawline, because the Gumballs series is very square-headed, and then kind of coming to this panel, which is from a newer publication he's working on, where he's drawing more rounded faces, and but thinking about like making art and making those things that make you well known, that you're known for, and then kind of like feeling almost scared to move past that. And that was a part of the discussion we had off camera with Erin, was, you know, that kind of like I want to do something different, but this is what I'm known for, so how do you like move past that? And, you know, he was talking about how he wasn't making art for a little while because he was scared of that transition to making more rounded faces, and then finally just like, screw it, like I'm gonna make some things. And I'm like, you know, just thinking as like an artist, like trying not to hold yourself back creatively by being stuck in like this known quantity of work. So it was really great to talk to Erin about kind of even just like what feels minor in a way, but it is like, it is such a big change in his work. And I think it's still really good and successful.
I think with Christine's work, you'll notice a lot of kind of similarities between the two because, and I will note that this is one of the artists that you gotta go to social media to see all her new work because that's where she's putting it, but that's where they're putting it. And Christine, their work is also really personal. It's about personal experience, it's about you know, considering their gender, it's about considering how they live in a bicultural experience. So they're both Mexican, from Mexican and from Caucasian background. And so living that experience and, you know, wondering, you know, about all of these things that relate to their personal life. And you'll see like, you know, really profound things where they're really sharing personal information. And they post this on Instagram. And they really want to talk about these things out in the open, and they also want to have conversations with people who are having those same kinds of experiences. But then there also, you'll see like really beautiful things that they post of just like, you know, everyday life, which I really love too, because it kind of gives me a window into this artist's world. You know, I really love the way Christine draws from her. She can, you know, work very simply with, you know, just like this outline of this figure, but then she will, you know, do things in color pencil and then scan them and do a lot of things digitally. She came into the workshop last Friday and taught students how to create a comic using Post-it notes and a pencil.
Yeah, it's really great hearing Christine talk about the work because while most of the work, especially I think everything here was originally created digitally and they work primarily digitally, they still use physical media all the time as far as like sketching, like just warm-up sketches, daily sketches, journal sketches, which I find really interesting as far as like that transfer between physical and digital, but kind of how you're thinking about making work. And I really liked hearing Christine talk about their color palettes as well during the workshop because they're like, coloring is hard and they don't like it, and I'm like, I totally get it. But they use minimal color palettes like in this purple and green panel and in this panel with the blue and peach and the pink, and thinking about like, well, there's a concept behind the panels. So especially like with the green and purple one, they're talking about their pronouns and, you know, trying to use different pronouns. So they're using one of the queer flags as the color palette for that. And so even though it's not like, you know, their husband doesn't have green hair, it still makes sense in that context. And so the colors take on a different meaning. It's not just like, you know, oh, this thing is this color. It's like the color palette itself can have concept and meaning, which I love about Christine's work. And it's very cute, and I love how cute their drawings are. And you'll see like on this like Meet the Artist, you'll see drawings of their cat and their dog, the little crown, and I always love them. They make artwork about Remy, and it's so cute. It's just like, it's just very accessible, I think, as far as like, you know, they're so talented to be able to make the work that they make, but it also feels accessible in a way that, you know, I think as artists we kind of get hung up on certain things, and I'm like, it's simplified down, but it's so skilled. And watching Christine work in the workshop was like really mind-blowing to see that like process of like, they're very skilled at what they do.
And did they bring their sketchbooks?
No, but we did like talk about sketchbooks a lot, and the workshop was really great because, and we have a recording of that hopefully will get online, but they talked about publishing a new book, which is the first time they've done a long form. Most of the time they just make little like, oh, here's a single panel comic for Instagram, or here's a short thing for Instagram, or here's a short thing for a publication she was hired to make. So this is like making a full graphic novel is like the first full long form project. And it was a lot about like time management, self-care, how to like cheat at making the work so you're not working harder, you're working smarter. And it was really like great to hear people talk, like to hear them talk about this in a way that you're like, oh yeah, like this is real things you have to think about as an artist. Like your body will deteriorate, and how do you make it last the longest, and how do you mentally sustain energy for like a book publication?
Yeah.
Like that's such a long timeline that I think, you know, especially students don't quite understand. Like, oh, you're making how many projects a semester? It's like oh no, you're working on one project for like 3 years. So it's like, how do you like make room for other creative things? So yeah, Christine's really amazing, and the more I like follow them and hear from them online, I'm just like so in awe of their like everything. It's awesome.
And Erin and Christine, we rock with us from the first show.
Yes. Do you want to talk about Melanie?
Yes,
Melanie's the third
She's
one.
our third.
Yeah.
They're our third, sorry. The rock. I'll let you talk.
Okay, so Melanie primarily works in color pencil. So they're one of the few that really mainly works in the physical media and then scans it and does digital text for the final product. But I'm always blown away by Melanie's work. And so we have some originals here. This is a reproduction because we just wanted to have it nice and large for people to look at. Just all this detail work and how gorgeous the scenes that Melanie draws are. But just this work, I mean, like, I remember when they shipped this in and I opened the package and I was just like, it just turned your whole day around to be like the most beautiful things you can look at. Plus we also got some like little surprises because when we requested work, we kind of just requested these panels. We didn't realize that there was like a second half to the page with even more panels. So it was such a like lovely moment to open that package from Melanie. But Melanie is such a, like, I just love their work so much, and they're so knowledgeable about comics, but also art and drawing that, like, I'm such a bad drawer now. Like, I haven't practiced in like 15 years. So I'm just like, anytime I see Melanie's work, I'm so blown away by it.
And I think, you know, they're unique in terms of like at least the artists in our show, and that they do work primarily in color pencil. So this is like a long process for them, and they just published this book last year. I'm sure, is that right, for 2019?
They're working on
COVID has
the second volume, maybe?
Yeah, they're working on the second one. But so this entire, like all the panels were done in colored pencil first, you know, and then scanned in, and then have the speech bubbles and the text added later. So just think about, you know, this is, how many pages? This is like 100 pages of drawing, 98 pages of drawing, and just thinking about like how long that takes to make, you know, each colored pencil panel.
And that's even like after you like draft the story and do thumbnails.
Yeah.
Like the whole thing is like you don't want to start into the actual long detailed drawing until after you've like, oh, I have a game plan of what I think I'm doing. Yeah.
Yeah, and this book Stage Dream is like, they spent a lot of time researching queer history and queer culture and like, you know, the Old West.
Mm-hmm.
And really was interested in like, you know, who were those people who were sort of like, you know, whose identities weren't out at the forefront like we can, you know, see now and engage now. And I think this is a really wonderful series. I can't wait for the second one because it was actually really exciting, like reading the book. It was like reading an old Western, but like with a more of a, you know, 21st century mindset in terms of like individuals and who they are. But you should check this out. It's, I mean, even though it's a lot of pages, you could sit in here and read it probably in 30 minutes.
Yeah. Well, and all the books that are in our like little gallery library are getting donated to the TCU library, so you can check it out at some point and then take it home and enjoy it instead of having to sit in this old book. Should we move on to Levi?
Yeah, we're going to talk about Levi.
Yeah.
Levi also does a similar thing where they're like really interested in history and culture. And y'all know what the Nib is. It's like an online magazine. They cover like culture and art and history. And so Levi's worked with, these are all Levi's illustration work, but they've worked with another, Gadbeck written by Josh. So they work with a writer, Josh Scheele, who creates all of the dialogue and the story, the narrative, and then he works on the visuals, works on the drawing and the illustration. But he really is interested in queer culture and queer history. And like, what was that like, back during the American Revolution? Or could there have been stories of queer individuals back during that time? And so I really love this work because it kind of gives you another way into history that is not talked about.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting having Levi here with Melanie on these walls, because Melanie is referencing history, but referencing personal histories of their own history to write fictional stories where Levi's really drawing straight from history. They're more historical, and sometimes they're based on actual people, so like Gattaca and Washington State General are about real people in history, queer history in our world, and how they kind of affected large things that we all know about. And so I really love Levi's work because he's bringing a whole different side of like actually doing this in-depth research with his writing partner and making these beautiful historical comics. So I recommend definitely checking out Levi's website. So I think, except for the first comic, everything else is just selections from these comics. They're much, much longer with a lot more detail. We just couldn't display everything because they're very detailed comics. But go read those either on his website or the Lynné's website, which are so great. But also really love that first one because he's talking about, I think, his grandmother-in-law and like kind of this cultural worry that they had, that he had, like visiting his in-laws. And so it's kind of funny, but based in like real fears, but having a pretty good outcome based around food. And so it's very relatable in a lot of ways, like even for, I think, people who are not part of the queer community, because there's always that being scared of meeting people that, you're not sure how they're gonna accept who you are and where you come from. And there are very specific themes, and not just Levi's work, but everyone's work, so their stories and what they're interested in. But that's one thing I love about all the artists in our show, is that they're so vulnerable and amazing in the way that they write the work, that it's so easy to kind of relate to the work in a lot of ways. And I was telling Iris and our panelists that we talked to last night, we haven't met hardly any of the artists in person, and yet I feel like I know them very well because I've read so much of their work. And I really appreciate their openness to being open with us, so, in their art form, so, yeah.
Should we talk about Jules?
Yeah, we can talk about this. That's a good segue from the way. So it's a good entrance.
Oh, we don't have any of that.
Yeah.
I was going to say we don't have any of those. So Jules is actually our only artist that's not US based. So Jules is in the UK. And Jules, most of their work is, they do a lot of work in sex education, gender education, and educating. We've got these 3 books, these wonderful books. One's on gender, one's on queer, and then one's on sexuality. We unfortunately couldn't fit all of the panels, and we picked their more personal work to display because we thought we had those books here for you all to see. And Jules' work is also, I feel like, really personal. It's very autobiographical. They're talking about gender dysmorphia and gender dysphoria and how how they've experienced that. And it can be kind of traumatic, I think, to look at this work. But also at the same time, I feel like there is, in some of the work, this sort of kind of revelation, a revelatory kind of experience, especially in this panel beyond. I really love, and then I also really want to say that their color palette is pretty amazing. It's very intense, like this sort of oranges and yellows, and they're kind of doing the same thing here, and then adding the hot pink. So you can kind of feel it makes you feel like the intensity behind the narrative with those colors.
I love their work, not just these are such amazing books, I highly recommend if you're a novice or even if you're not. There's so much history in these, and there's it's amazing. Just the amount of like research that's condensed into a very consumable format, I think, because I'm not the best at reading books without pictures. So this is like such a great way for me to kind of like learn so much in a way that is very digestible. But their personal, like Jules's personal work is, like Iris has said, is just very beautiful, and like that's one thing Iris and I are very like with this show are concerned about is not just like the content of the work, but just the beauty of the work as well. As artists, I think we're really drawn to beautiful art, and so it's kind of like we want to highlight that in this show. And it's not that, you know, to kind of show that yes, comics are an art form, they're a valid art form, and just showing like the skill and beauty that is present in this medium. And the words, like while like the sequentialness of the work and the words is something in the art world we're not as familiar with or used to, it's like it adds just such another layer when it's paired with this beautiful artwork. And so like I've definitely read comics in the past where they changed a lot, like artists on the comic, and it was so hideous I had to just like drop it completely. I'm like, I'm invested in this story, but I cannot look at these terrible drawings anymore. And so I think that, you know, comics is a media where every component is so important as a reader, whether you know it consciously or not, that, you know, if you're not liking the writing, it doesn't matter how beautiful it is, it's gonna just fall flat. And if you don't like the art, it doesn't matter how compelling it is, and sometimes it's just really hard to stick with it if you're just not feeling the style. And so, and I also really like Jules, they experiment a lot with their work, and so you end up with like watercolor and pen and ink and things like that. But you also have, they work on this thing called, they have a zine that they publish. It's a mixtape zine, so it's more just kind of like short stories, individual panels. So again, like playing with like more traditional comic style, educational full-length books, and then kind of having these little quick zines with like kind of a mixture of things in them, which is really interesting. So,
and Jules also works with the writer.
yeah,
So,
Meg John Barker is a PhD that Jules works with. So all these are by those at Jules. So.
And I do want to note in this panel specifically, because I guess we could talk about Kosmo next. But thinking about like, you know, when you look at comics and like in the actual reading, sometimes you're being asked by the artist to read just the images and not read the text. So then again, that brings us back to like, you know, comics as an art form, and they are an art form. And I feel like, you know, Jules does a really good job here for us of creating that narrative just with the artwork and not necessarily having like a bunch of text. And I think, you know, that might even be strategic on their part in terms of like wanting it just to be read visually and wanting that to be the part that you focus on, and that to be like kind of like, you know, bringing you into their space and into the intensity of that experience.
The image has to do a lot of work.
Yeah.
But it's very powerful.
Yeah.
It's hard not to talk about every single artist.
So again, Kosmo is doing that here as well, where there's no text in the panel, and Z works a lot in one-shots. So, with the exception, I think of like, are these all one-shots? I forget sometimes.
No, that's a full.
This one's a full comic. Sometimes it's hard to tell on their website.
Well, and Zayd's done things in anthologies, so that's more of like a short comic itself, like in a larger book of a collection of comics. So Kosmo's really working in singles on their website, or one-shots on their website, or in these kind of like what feel like maybe like a floppy size, where it's like not a full graphic novel, but it's really like kind of a contained story with multiple pages.
Yeah. And they're also really trying to kind of unpack identity and unpack gender, and unpack what those things mean, what those words mean, what those experiences mean, and in a very autobiographical way. Yeah, if you notice when you're looking at Kosmo's work, you'll notice the signature of the artist. So Kosmo's actually like changed names since we have curated this exhibition. So I think that that's really an important part of this person's work is seeing how they evolve. And we've talked
about Erin kind of evolving in terms of like her style. Well, also, Kosmo is like evolving as a person. So I think we'll probably be seeing like some new work kind of dealing with those kinds of things. But one of the things I do love about Kosmo's work is this sort of like, she works in a lot of black and white. So you won't see a ton of color. You do see it, here and there, but there's a lot of black and white. I really like the kind of really graphic quality of this work. And I love this sort of like playing around with like where the text is and this sort of like, not really linear layout of, some of these panels where you're kind of having to think about like, where do I start with this? And it's kind of, where do I go into the reading of this?
Yeah, I love the non-traditional panel layout. It makes you think as a reader, like there's an inherentness to the medium of comics that I think because of Sunday comics and even like the little guides and airplane of the safety manual is a comic, right? So it's like we innately kind of understand the medium and how to read it and what the gutters mean and all of that. So when artists really play with what that is as a reader, I find like super interesting and just really love when artists play with that. What do you want to go to next?
I don't know.
You want to do Sunmi?
Yeah,
yeah. I was like,
we'll be more like linear, we'll just go back. So, again, we have some originals. So, I think from here to there, these are all original, these are you can see, like, when you get close, the beautiful, meticulous art making that they did to create this composition. I'm just like, I'm a real nature lover, so I fell in love with Sunmi's work. And if you go online to their website and look at how some of their work is colorized and how they use watercolor and pen and ink, to me, it's like really, really, really luscious artwork that you just fall in love with. And again, they're dealing again with this idea of like gender and what that means. And so we have also some digital images of their work. They also work, they have work in zines, and they had this beautiful little 3D comic that we weren't able to get. But
there's only one, and I'm
there's
like,
only one. You can go online and see it, and it's just really beautiful. It's got this kind of like transparent material quality.
Yeah.
And again, earlier Lynné was mentioning how Melanie draws on their experience, but then creates this kind of fictional narrative. And Sunmi does a similar thing where, they are drawing on personal experiences, but it's really like creating these other stories and kind of imbuing back those stories with their experience.
Yeah. And I love Sunmi's scenes on their website. They're just so beautiful and they're interesting as far as like references that they're bringing in. So like the two large panels are scans from a smaller zine. It's only a few pages, but it's actually a serigraph, so that's printmaking processes that's going on there. But it's kind of this idea of like this love affair with the ocean and the sea, and but a kind of a queer version of that, which is really interesting. And they're just beautiful drawings that it's hard to not fall in love with. But then also some of their other ones about kind of like gender and anime and things like that are like they've redrawn like Sailor Moon and things like that, and so you end up kind of with this like interesting like social commentary on these like pop culture icons, especially in like Asian culture that they're drawing on for their work. But and those are really gorgeous, and I wish we had more space to show more work of all of our artists, but the pencil and pen work that they sent us is just, we're like, we have to include all of this because it's so beautiful. You can go read Cameraman online. I think you just like pay what you want to download the PDF. I highly recommend whatever they recommend, just add a couple bucks to that, get a little bonus. But this is in color online, and so you really get to see this like pen and ink to draw into like a colored digital version. And in this 1 to 10 minutes, they're actually working on this to be a book. So this will be a full-blown like graphic novel that's coming out. And as a photographer, I personally find this really interesting because they're taking photos while the story is happening. But then there'll be like a moment where you see the photograph, and then you see these like little drawings on top of like where Sunmi's like cut it out and pasted it onto the actual photograph of the scene that's in the comic. And so you have this nice mixture of like photography and comics and
collage.
it's just so good. Like it's like really hard not to just like love every moment of it. So
And one of the wonderful things about the show, and even like when we created the show in 2019, is having these original works. You really get to see like how these artists work, and you can see here how they've like either made these speech bubbles out before and kind of drawn out the panel, and then Xerox or scan them in, and then drawn around them because you can see some of the text behind this, and these are also double-sided. We couldn't
we
figure
had
out
to make
where to
decisions.
go.
It was hard.
But these are double-sided, so they're working on two sides of the paper. So you get, I don't know if you can see, you can kind of see some of the like edges of the other side, like a tiny bit. And you can see some of where they're using like one of those non-copy pencils where they're like kind of figuring out, how their layout is going to be. I also love seeing like all the little page numbers. So it gives you a sense of like, where they're building to.
Well, like all Melody stuff, you see like fingerprints from like the plugins. Should we run to?
Yeah.
Let's go over here to see.
Okay.
This is Ashanti's as well, but we also have more facing the window. There's so much good stuff. It's hard to like see it all. But Ashanti is a really interesting artist. So they do make autobiographical work. So you see that kind of in the panel that's on the wall over there. But they really draw from their personal narrative to make more fictionalized stories. And so I love their work. It's so beautiful. Again, like I'm drawn to the non-traditional, like, panel formats that you kind of see in their work. But they have a long-running comic called Olympus, which is the center panel is from. So you can read that whole thing online for free. So, but they're drawing from their background as being disabled and biracial and bringing that into these kind of sci-fi stories, but also into like with this capturing comfort, which is really like based in reality and like social media and like how that affects certain people, especially during the pandemic. So kind of having this story, which is more fictionalized reality, but still it's really easy to see kind of how these characters are feeling in this, because we've all had the worst 2 years. And so kind of connecting with that through their work is really great.
One of the things I love about Ashanti is if you go to their website, you'll see that, these here that we have kind of have a similar relationship in their style, but what Ashanti does is when they're creating the narrative, they feel, the sort of like independence and ability to change their style. So you might read, this one's just a little bit different than Olympus, but there's some that are even more different. And there's some more like autobiographical work that is very different in terms of how they're treating the figure and how they're drawing in the panels and all of those kinds of things. So I find that really interesting because as artists, we're all told to be consistent. Be consistent so that when someone sees your work, they know who you are.
Yeah.
And I think that's really great about Ashanti's work. And also the same thing goes for comic book artists or cartoonists. Like they're trained to kind of develop this like consistent style so someone knows that's your work without even like seeing the information in a book or in a graphic novel. And so I love that Ashanti feels like that they have the ability and the freedom to do that, and it's all really good. None of it none of it is bad or poorly drawn, of course. But I think what's interesting is that they're able to kind of tailor that style to whatever the narrative is. Like I really like how here they're drawing some of the figures a little bit more loosely, and the color palette
also very different. I would love to learn more about Ashanti's color palette because a lot of Galanthus is like kind of these really, beautiful like violets and blues in that comic. And then in this one, in the Fountain, and then in Heritage, there's another one in Heritage. There's a lot of like greens and blues and
oranges and yeah. Should we move to? Yeah. We have a few more, so I'm like trying to think about time. But so Trinidad is one of our amazing artists from California. Definitely, if you were like, I want to read a lot of content, Trinidad's website is just full of everything, and so it's definitely worth like checking out.
I think again, Trinidad is similar to Ashanti in that she is really thinking about the narrative and the drawing as being, symbiotic, as having a relationship. And so she's like, if she's doing something for the knit that's on, queer history, then she might draw something, very more, with more outlines, more like kind of graphically, more cartoony. And then if she's doing something that's more personal, she does like these wonderful poem comics, and I haven't seen that yet. I've seen a lot of like journalism comics, but poem comics, I was really blown away by the idea of that. And so then you've got kind of like a more muted palette, and you've got, kind of a looser, more kind of almost romantic drawing style, I think. And then you see like her, her short comic Filipino Beauty Queen, and it's hilarious and fun, and she draws it very differently than she does her poem comics. She also does really, really creepy horror comics. I want to buy all of them. They're all sold out in the book form or in zine form, but you can download them digitally.
So good.
Yeah, there's it.
If you have questions, feel free just to like shout some out.
Oh, actually, Rebecca's our fourth artist that we brought from the first curation, because we did invite Rebecca to be in the first show in 2019, and it didn't work out, and so we just loved her work so much that we decided to ask again, and fortunately she was able to commit, and so she's a painter and a zine maker, and so all of these digital images are from paintings. Like I think that one's watercolor, but most of them I think are acrylic or little panel. She sells her work on Etsy. She sells all these wonderful little zines. A lot of it is about self-care or about, practicing herbal self-care and kind of like living holistically. And then some of these are sort of like more like
little like witchcraft.
Little witchcraft kind of thing.
So you can read your fortune. Yeah. So I'm like, I love the idea of like how Rebecca approaches it with zine format, but also she calls these little zines.
Yeah.
And like there's little comics that are in it. So you just want to keep like reading your fortune and like seeing the story unfold, the little narrative is so great. And I love origami and sculptural things, so I'm especially drawn to those. But I just love this like thought process of like a comic and what a comic can be, and kind of moving from like, like that's a very untraditional panel layout, but from a more traditional panel layout to like a single panel, like telling a lot to zines, to fortune tellers. They're so beautiful, and yeah.
Yeah, and she's pulling from her indigenous background when she's creating, the themes and the comics. So it's really all kind of, imbued with like the history of that, and connection to the land, connection to the earth, connection to spirits.
Yeah. That's right. Got two more. So many artists we have not talked about. But so Antoinette is an artist that I originally found on Instagram like a couple years ago, and I've just been following. But one thing I really love about Antoinette's work is her use of a single panel comic. So that's how she creates comics. She doesn't create multiple panels. It's usually one image, one frame, telling an entire story. So we kind of don't see this in comics as much anymore. It's really more in like newspapers. So like the New York Times, like they still have single panel comics. They're more like journalism in a way, like they're political commentary, and they're usually black and white. So that's one thing I really love about Antoinette's work is her use of color, but also like how she's talking about race, how she's talking about anxiety, how she's talking about culture. I think really is like abrupt sometimes, but in a way that really like addresses the issue in such a like pinpoint of a moment that it really just gets it across in a way that you'll read an entire book and it's just not as clearly and succinct as the way that she does it. I really also, this is not how she normally shows work. It's usually on screen, flipping through, you see one at a time. But I love like coming around the corner and seeing this grid of color and all of this kind of like narrative that is so important, but also really beautiful. So it's a nice little like space in our show that I feel I love to come visit.
Yeah, and I really love how she's using color, and it's kind of like this sort of muted color. I mean, even like, you know, this is more like a lavender than a like true purple. But then I also love this very beautiful monochromatic, where it's kind of making you kind of pay attention to and think about, you know, skin color, right? The comic is actually about skin color, and then, you know, she's got this color palette that is like, you know, looks like skin color.
Yeah. I love this work.
I do.
I mean, I love all of it. It's so hard to choose.
Yeah, and Christine Marty works similarly to Antoinette in that a lot of her work she puts straight onto Instagram too. She does have a book called Kokoro that's about growing up Asian American, Japanese American, and about going back to Japan and kind of, you know, like experiencing the culture when she grew up here. And but most of her comics are about her identity or her struggle with depression and anxiety. And reading these, it's like, again, you know, you're being allowed to go into this artist's world.
It's so vulnerable.
It's very vulnerable, and, you know, I'm sure it's really difficult to do that on social media, especially. But I think, you know, and Erin Nations, I think, said it yesterday when we had the talk, and I think he mentioned how it was sort of like therapy. Like that's sort of like why he makes the work about his personal experiences. Like he has to kind of wants to put it out there.
Get it out and like,
so I think for Christine, it's kind of, you know, similar, but also wanting to kind of bring mental illness into a conversation and not have the stigma anymore. And I think we're moving towards that. But also her work is all black and white.
It's all black and white, which is super rare. Like even Kosmo uses some color more than Christine does. I think there was one in the entire catalog of her work that had like a hint of color. But I also, this is like reproduced to be in a physical space, but because it's Christine publishes for Instagram, you get each panel and it's in the carousels in the feed. So you're really like revealing it as you're flipping through the carousel, which this was the thing we talked about yesterday with some of the artists, was about the medium of comics and digital, and how like, you know, digital's really changed how comics are, but also like social media has changed so much about how comics are, and like the format of comics not being kind of your standard like open a book, you have your panels, like how do you format a comic for digital consumption? And like that there's been really terrible versions of that in the beginning of comics moving online, but then you have artists like Christine who's just using it as like, oh, like Instagram has this format, let's use that format to scroll through the panels. And so it's a really great way, I think, to reveal, like a page turn would reveal in a physical piece. But all of her comics are 9 or 10 panels, so it is, again, perfect for that carousel, which is limited to 10. But I highly recommend going through and just reading everything. I think I did preparation for the show, and it's just so interesting reading their experiences with depression, which are pretty intense, but also like really important conversations to have about mental health, but also like their heritage and like living in America, but also moving to Japan and living in Japan and like being biracial, and how that really affects how she's seen by the outside world and how she sees herself, and then how that also feeds into her art and her depression. It's so vulnerable in a way that is really, it's great, but it's also like she's really put herself out there, which we're blessed to have that information from her. Like she doesn't have to share all that, and she does, and it's really great. But it's like seeing like Christine's work paired with Antoinette's work, who's making similar work and conceptually, but also it's physically very different. And having this kind of like multiple viewpoints is so great for the show. Yeah, that's the entire show. Now that we've done the entire show, any questions or comments, I guess?
Just thinking about you talking about the last two artists being primarily for digital, but you reproduce them here in print format.
Yeah.
Have you considered ways to display digital art closer to the way it's shown there instead of converting it back to a more traditional viewing experience?
Yeah, I think as far as like galleries, that's a hard thing. I think in all art, not just comics. I think comics bring up a really interesting like immediacy to that conversation, and even just having like physical comic books in the gallery, it's like it's not really a space that's designed for people to sit and read, which is half the reason we brought in some benches and we have some books, and some of this work is in those books, so people can actually sit and physically read if they want to. But also knowing that people won't do a lot of the things you want them to do as a visitor. And I think digital is hard. Like I think a projection would maybe be an option for certain things, but still having that interactivity, like maybe some sort of touch screen, which is difficult now because of COVID. So I don't know, it's hard because, I think work that is made so for the digital world, it is hard to figure out how to bring it to a physical location. And then I think it's been difficult to have physical work make it to a digital platform. So I don't know if there's a good answer. I don't know if I have a good answer for that, but I will say I think that's things we thought about while working on all these versions of the show.
I think one of the things too that I think about is like the tangibility of something. Like I always think about things that are intangible, like the way we deal with money now. Like we hardly ever have like cash money in our hand. It's always like this like number on a card or in a bank account. And so I really like bringing the things that are made digitally back into kind of like the tactile nature of like being an object in the world. And also thinking about like art, and art and trying to sort of like get people to look at comics as an art form and not that, we need to like make it an object to legitimize it, but I think that helps a little bit, and even like with Lynné Bowman's work and, printing out that large photograph of one of her small, colored pencil drawings is again sort of like giving it sort of like a more of a like, this is art, y'all, let's pay attention.
And I think scale is also a big thing as well. Like, we're so used to seeing comics really tiny. So this being an unusual format for some of the work was like, okay, well, we can really play the scale because a lot of it's digital. And so we can print it larger and really like give it some presence and give it like a physicality that it doesn't have in the digital world. And we know this isn't like the normal venue for this work. So it really is nice to have that like opportunity to, play with it in a way that really draws in maybe an art audience to comics that haven't thought about comics as art. And I think that's one thing we talk about a lot just on our own is we both read comics, but we're both artists and we both work in, art institutions as curators and managers. And so it's like kind of that like, being dismissed as not art and being crafts art in a lot of ways. And we both have backgrounds in photography, so there's a whole history of photography going through the same thing in the 20th century. And so I think it's kind of, I think it's, something that people shouldn't blow off. Like comics are really valid art. And when people go, I'm like, okay, well, like, have you looked at it? Have you seen what's out there? Because it's amazing.
Yeah.
And even like the big names, like I don't want to blow off like Marvel and DC, like they're really expanding how they do comics, who they have work on those comics, and the type of art that they accept now. And so they're not anywhere near like the, you know, experimentation level that a lot of our artists are at, but, you know, it's really nice to see they're not just so like stuck with Superman being a certain way, and like seeing some change happen in even those big titles that have $1 million movie franchises. So, yeah, like being open to experimentation. So
I also love the idea of like, you know, sort of, you know, pushing someone to think about something in a different way. So like bringing things that are normally like digital or that you experience, you know, only digital, and then bringing it into this sort of like more object form, kind of like changes people's experience. And I really want to like, you know, kind of push at people to experience something in a different way because we live so digitally. I mean, you know, art, you know, people are selling, what are those? I'm sorry.
oh, NFTs.
NFTs, I mean, like, you know, and so I'm of like the mindset of like, yes, let's like think about digital and let's think about like the things we can do with digital, but let's also still have beautiful objects, and have that sort of like really direct, you know, person to object experience. I'm a big fan of poetics of space. And so I really think about like how we're experiencing the world, and to me sometimes like that digital experience is there's an absence there. And so I really like bringing, you know, and these normally you see them like, you know, teeny. And so I think they have more of a presence, you know, especially in a space like this.
Cool. Well, thanks so much for coming. And
That was a really good question.
yes, it's like it's interesting to see where comics will go, and galleries too. I think that's a thing to think about. But yeah. Well, thanks, guys.